The First Thanksgiving, Part 1, Surviving the New World. Imagine this: a gray November sky hangs over the cold, choppy waters of Cape Cod Bay. The year is 1620, and a creaking wooden ship called the Mayflower has just anchored off the coast of a strange and wild land. Inside are 102 weary passengers, men, women, and children, the people who would later be remembered as the Pilgrims. They are sick, exhausted, and frightened. For 66 long days, they've battled storms, disease, and despair across the Atlantic. Now, as they stare at the rugged, untamed coastline, they realize something chilling: this place is nothing like home. No towns. No farms. No friendly faces. Just endless forests, icy winds, and a future no one can predict. Among them are people seeking religious freedom, English Puritans who fled persecution under King James I. They had hoped to settle near the Hudson River, but storms forced them hundreds of miles north. They are far from their intended destination, and winter is closing in fast. It's important to know that not everyone on the Mayflower shared the same dream. Roughly half of the passengers were saints, devout separatists seeking a new life where they could worship freely. The other half were strangers, tradesmen, laborers, and adventurers hired by the London Company to help build a colony. This mix made things complicated. Tensions ran high. When they realized they had landed outside the Virginia Company's charter, some of the strangers began to rebel, arguing that no one had authority here. The group teetered on the edge of chaos. But before setting foot on land, they did something remarkable: they agreed to govern themselves. On November 11, 1620, they signed the Mayflower Compact, a short but revolutionary document. It pledged loyalty to the king, but, more importantly, it created a government, for the general good of the colony. It was the first experiment in self-government in the New World, a seed of democracy that would, centuries later, grow into the ideals of the United States. Once ashore, the Pilgrims faced a brutal reality. The icy wind bit through their thin clothing. They had little food left. The forest was dense, unfamiliar, and filled with sounds of unseen creatures. They first landed at the tip of Cape Cod, then later crossed the bay to a place the native people called Patuxet, an abandoned Wampanoag village devastated by a mysterious plague years earlier. The Pilgrims renamed it Plymouth. In December, they began building small houses and a communal meeting house. But disease and hunger soon struck. Pneumonia, scurvy, and exhaustion swept through the group. By the end of that first winter, half of the settlers were dead, men, women, and children buried quietly in the frozen ground. Graves were disguised to hide their losses from the native tribes watching from the woods. The survivors were haunted, weak, and desperate. Yet somehow, they endured. While the Pilgrims struggled to survive, the land around them was home to powerful native nations, the Wampanoag Confederacy, led by a sachem named Massasoit. For generations, the Wampanoag people had lived on this land, fishing its rivers, hunting in its forests, and planting corn, beans, and squash in its fields. They knew every season, every tide, every plant. Their world was balanced, rooted in a deep respect for nature and community. But the arrival of Europeans had already changed everything. In the years before the Mayflower, English explorers and traders had brought devastating epidemics. Between 1616 and 1619, diseases wiped out as much as 90% of the native population along the New England coast. Entire villages were emptied, including Patuxet, the very place where the Pilgrims built Plymouth. To the Wampanoag, this land was sacred and filled with memory. To the Pilgrims, it was a gift, open and ready. Neither side could yet see how deeply their fates were now intertwined. Then, in March of 1621, something extraordinary happened. As the snow melted and spring light returned, a tall native man walked boldly into the Pilgrim settlement. He wore deerskin clothing and carried a bow and arrows. The settlers were stunned, and even more shocked when he spoke to them in English. His name was Samoset, an Abenaki chief from what is now Maine. He had learned English from fishermen who had visited the coast. Samoset greeted them with the words, "Welcome, Englishmen." It must have felt like a miracle. Samoset spoke with the settlers, asking for beer, food, and sharing news about the surrounding tribes. He told them of the great sachem Massasoit and the people of the Wampanoag. He promised to return, and a few days later, he did, bringing with him another man who would change everything, Tisquantum, better known as Squanto. Squanto's story is one of tragedy and fate. Years before the Mayflower arrived, he had been kidnapped by an English explorer, sold into slavery in Spain, and later escaped to England, where he learned the language and customs. Eventually, he found a way back home, only to discover that his entire village, Patuxet, had been wiped out by disease. He was the last of his people. And now, fate had brought him face to face with strangers living on his ancestral land. But instead of vengeance, Squanto chose compassion. He saw their suffering, starving, freezing, helpless in a land they didn't understand. He decided to help. He taught them how to plant corn, burying fish as fertilizer. He showed them how to find eels and clams, how to navigate the rivers, and how to recognize medicinal plants. With his guidance, Plymouth began to live, not just survive. Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader, watched all this carefully. He too faced uncertainty. Other tribes, like the Narragansett, were growing stronger, and his people were still recovering from disease. An alliance with these English settlers might be useful. In March 1621, Massasoit and his men approached Plymouth. They were met by armed pilgrims, tense and afraid. Through Squanto and Samoset, the two sides spoke, exchanged gifts, and made an agreement, a peace treaty promising mutual protection and respect. It was a fragile trust, but for the moment, it held. The months that followed were transformative. Under Squanto's teaching and Massasoit's peace, the Pilgrims' fortunes began to turn. They planted corn that grew tall and strong. They learned the rhythm of this new land, its tides, its seasons, its soil. Governor William Bradford, who had taken leadership after the death of John Carver, recorded that the colony was well recovered in health and strength. By the summer of 1621, Plymouth was alive again, fields of green, cabins standing firm, children playing outside. The settlers had made it through their first year. And when autumn arrived, bringing a bountiful harvest, gratitude filled their hearts. What came next would become one of the most enduring legends in American history, a feast shared between two very different peoples, who, for a brief moment in time, found common ground. But that moment, the first Thanksgiving, was far more complex, fragile, and human than the simple story we often tell. And to understand it fully, we have to step deeper into that autumn of 1621, into the sounds of laughter and drums, the smell of roasted venison and corn, the uneasy peace between strangers, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build a new beginning together. The First Thanksgiving, Part 2, The Feast of Friendship. The year was 1621. After a brutal winter and a season of rebirth, the fields around Plymouth were bursting with life. The corn stood high and golden, pumpkins ripened in the sun, and the settlers finally had enough to fill their bellies. For the first time since leaving England, they felt a fragile sense of peace. The graves of their loved ones were behind them, but so was starvation. And so, in late September or early October, Governor William Bradford and Captain Miles Standish decided, it was time to celebrate, to give thanks. But what they didn't realize was that this simple act would one day become a symbol, one that Americans would remember for centuries as the first Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims had much to be thankful for. Their first harvest had been abundant, beyond their expectations. Their crops, corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, taught by the Wampanoag, had flourished. There were berries and nuts in the forests, wild turkeys and ducks along the marshes, and rivers filled with fish. Governor Bradford called for a feast to celebrate the harvest and give thanks to God. The settlers prepared for days, hunting, cooking, brewing ale, and roasting fowl over open fires. The women worked tirelessly, kneading bread from barley, boiling pumpkins into a sweet mash, and drying fruits for winter storage. The men cleaned their muskets and organized games and contests for sport. It was more than a meal. It was a declaration of survival, a moment of relief after months of grief. And soon, the celebration grew larger than anyone expected. Word of the feast reached Massasoit, the Wampanoag sachem, who had honored the peace treaty with the settlers for months. Out of respect, and perhaps curiosity, he arrived at Plymouth with 90 of his men. Imagine that, 53 surviving settlers and 90 native warriors, suddenly together in one place. It could have been tense, even dangerous. But instead, something remarkable happened. The Wampanoag brought gifts, baskets of freshly caught fish, smoked eels, and 5 deer for roasting. The Pilgrims welcomed them warmly, offering roasted fowl, corn pudding, and savory stews simmering in iron pots. No written record describes a turkey dinner. In fact, what they shared was a true fusion of two worlds: venison, wild birds, shellfish, corn cakes, and stews flavored with herbs and roots unfamiliar to English tongues. The Wampanoag had taught them how to live off the land, and now they were feasting on that knowledge. The feast lasted 3 days. There was music, laughter, games, and prayers. The men fired muskets into the air in joyful salutes, while Wampanoag hunters demonstrated their skill with bows and arrows. Children played together, mimicking their fathers' hunting stances and mothers' chores. At times, you could hear the rhythmic beat of native drums echoing through the trees. The settlers, though cautious, joined in, clapping and dancing awkwardly but sincerely. It wasn't perfect harmony. There were language barriers, cultural divides, and lingering fear. But for those few days, they shared something human: food, stories, gratitude, and hope. Imagine the scene: the golden leaves of autumn swirling through the air, smoke rising from fires, the scent of roasting meat mingling with the salt of the nearby sea. The settlers wearing their plain English wool, the Wampanoag adorned with feathers and beads, two peoples, so different, sitting together beneath the same sky. Modern Thanksgiving tables overflow with roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. But in 1621, things looked very different. There was no sugar, no butter, and certainly no ovens for baking pies. There were no potatoes or sweet potatoes. They hadn't yet reached New England from South America. Instead, they feasted on what the land provided. Venison, roasted over open fires. Wild fowl, ducks, geese, and perhaps some turkeys. Fish and shellfish, cod, bass, clams, and mussels. Cornbread, porridge, and boiled vegetables. Berries, nuts, and pumpkin mash cooked with spices. They drank water, maybe a little homemade beer, and thanked heaven for each bite. To them, it wasn't a holiday, it was a miracle. The alliance between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag was one of necessity, and mutual benefit. The settlers needed food and protection. The Wampanoag needed allies against rival tribes, particularly the Narragansett to the west. Massasoit's diplomacy made that possible. During the feast, he and Governor Bradford reaffirmed their friendship, pledging once again that neither side would harm the other. For a brief, shining moment, there was balance. But beneath the laughter and the shared meals, both peoples knew the truth: peace in the New World would never be simple. The Pilgrims saw this land as their promised land, a place to build a godly society. The Wampanoag saw it as their sacred home, passed down through countless generations. They could not yet imagine how quickly that fragile peace would begin to crumble in the decades to come. Still, in that autumn of 1621, there was no war, no betrayal, only gratitude and cautious trust. And perhaps that's why the story endured. Because even if the harmony was temporary, it was real. For the Pilgrims, giving thanks was a spiritual act. They believed every blessing, from a loaf of bread to a sunny day, was a gift from God. The Bible was filled with psalms of gratitude, and prayer framed every meal. But for the Wampanoag, gratitude was something deeper and older. Their entire culture revolved around Thanksgiving rituals, ceremonies for the harvest, the hunt, the changing seasons, and life itself. They offered tobacco to the earth, sang to the rivers, and honored the spirits of the animals they hunted. In a sense, both peoples shared a belief in giving thanks, but for very different reasons. The Pilgrims thanked their God for deliverance, the Wampanoag thanked the earth for balance. For 3 days, those beliefs intertwined. It was a rare moment when two worlds prayed under the same sun. Governor Bradford later wrote of that autumn with deep emotion. In his journal, of Plymouth Plantation, he described how the settlers set their houses in order, and reaped a plentiful harvest. Though he never used the word Thanksgiving, he recorded how they rejoiced and feasted. Edward Winslow, another Pilgrim leader, wrote even more vividly. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together. Many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. It's from these simple words that the entire legend of Thanksgiving was born. Just a few lines in a colonial diary, but they echoed through centuries. It's easy to imagine this moment as pure harmony, smiling faces, overflowing tables, and eternal peace. But history is never so simple. There were misunderstandings, silent fears, and the unspoken weight of the unknown future. The Pilgrims, though grateful, still viewed the Wampanoag through the lens of difference. The Wampanoag, though generous, knew these newcomers were unpredictable. Yet despite it all, they came together. Not as conquerors or victims, but as survivors. As people who understood what hunger and loss felt like. As human beings, giving thanks for one more day of life. That, more than anything, is the true spirit of the first Thanksgiving. When the fires burned low on the 3rd night and the Wampanoag prepared to return to their villages, there was no sense that they had created a national holiday. To them, it was simply a good harvest, a time to share food, laughter, and gratitude. For the Pilgrims, it was a sign from God that their colony might endure. They had come close to death and found life again. As dawn broke over the quiet clearing, the air carried the smell of wood smoke and sea salt. Children slept near the hearth. The settlers bowed their heads in prayer. And the Wampanoag disappeared into the forests, leaving behind a peace that would last, for now. It would be generations before anyone called it Thanksgiving. But in that brief, hopeful season of 1621, they lived it, together. The First Thanksgiving, Part 3, From a Harvest Feast to a National Holiday. When the fires of the 1621 feast faded, the story of that gathering nearly disappeared with the smoke. No parades. No fixed date. No holiday. For the Pilgrims, it was simply a good harvest and a moment to breathe before the next hard winter. And yet, over the centuries, that humble celebration would transform into one of America's most powerful symbols, Thanksgiving Day. How did it happen? How did a 3-day meal shared by barely 100 people become a ritual observed by millions? To answer that, we must follow the trail of memory, through war, rebirth, and the making of a nation. In the years following 1621, the peace between Plymouth and the Wampanoag held, for a while. Squanto remained with the settlers as translator and guide until his death in 1622. He was mourned deeply. Bradford wrote that he had been a special instrument sent of God. But beyond Plymouth, tension grew. More English ships arrived. More land was claimed. The fragile balance began to tilt. By the 1670s, a generation after Massasoit's death, his son Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, led a desperate war to defend native lands. Villages burned on both sides. Thousands died. The dream of harmony vanished in smoke and blood. To the colonists, the first Thanksgiving soon became a distant memory, overshadowed by survival and conflict. Yet every so often, the people of New England still called for a day of thanks, not to honor the Wampanoag, but to thank God for victories, harvests, or peace after war. It was gratitude, yes, but it had changed. Through the 1600s and 1700s, there was no single Thanksgiving Day. Each colony, and later, each state, declared its own whenever there was something to celebrate. One governor might proclaim a fast and prayer day in May, another might call a feast in November after a good harvest or a military victory. Even George Washington, in 1789, proclaimed the first national Thanksgiving after America's independence. In his address, he asked citizens to thank the great author of every public and private good. But the holiday didn't yet belong to the people, it was an occasional, solemn act, not an annual tradition. Then came the 19th century, and a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale. You may not know her name, but you know her work. She wrote the poem, Mary Had a Little Lamb. Sarah Josepha Hale was more than a writer, she was one of the first female editors in American journalism. She believed passionately that a unified nation needed shared traditions, and she had her eyes set on one, Thanksgiving. In the 1840s, Hale began a campaign that would last 17 years. She wrote editorials, letters to governors, and appeals to every U.S. president. In her magazine, Godey's Lady's Book, she published stories painting Thanksgiving as a warm, family-centered holiday, a time of gratitude, reunion, and moral reflection. She imagined long tables filled with roast turkey, pumpkin pie, and prayers, a far cry from the rough feast of 1621, but a vision that captured hearts. For nearly 2 decades, presidents ignored her pleas. Then, in 1863, as the nation bled from civil war, her letter reached Abraham Lincoln. It was the darkest year of the Civil War. The Union had just won at Gettysburg, but tens of thousands lay dead. The nation was shattered. In October 1863, moved by Hale's appeal, President Abraham Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for a national day of Thanksgiving, to be held on the last Thursday of November. Lincoln wrote, "They are the gracious gifts of the Most High God, who, while dealing with us in anger for our sins, hath nevertheless remembered mercy." It was an act of faith, and of healing. Thanksgiving was no longer just a colonial harvest festival. It became a promise that, even in sorrow, Americans could unite in gratitude. From that year forward, presidents followed Lincoln's example. The tradition was reborn. By the late 1800s, schoolbooks began teaching the story of the Pilgrims and the friendly Indians sharing the first Thanksgiving. It was a simplified tale, easy to illustrate and easy to love. The new nation needed heroes, origins, and moral lessons, and the Pilgrims fit perfectly. Artists painted smiling settlers and noble natives passing plates of turkey. Children wore paper hats and feathered headbands in school plays. The true complexity of the encounter, the loss, disease, and war that followed, faded into the background. Thanksgiving became less about 1621 and more about America's identity, faith, perseverance, and family. And for millions of immigrants arriving at Ellis Island, it became something else, a way to become American. Sharing that meal, giving thanks together, symbolized belonging to this new homeland. By the 20th century, Thanksgiving had grown into a major cultural event. Families traveled across states. Parades marched through city streets. Football games filled radios and later televisions. The first Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade was held in 1924, featuring live animals from the Central Park Zoo. Then, in 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt officially set the date as the 4th Thursday of November, the Thanksgiving we know today. But even as the holiday became a symbol of national unity, another conversation began to emerge, a more honest one. For the Wampanoag and many other native peoples, the story told in schoolbooks felt incomplete, even painful. They remembered not a feast of eternal friendship, but the beginning of centuries of displacement, broken treaties, and loss. In 1970, during the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' Landing, Wampanoag leader Frank James, Wamsuta, was invited to speak at a celebration in Plymouth. When officials read his speech and found it too critical, they refused to let him deliver it. So he and others gathered on Coles Hill, overlooking Plymouth Harbor, and declared the day a national day of mourning. Every year since, native communities have returned there to honor their ancestors and speak truth about what followed that first encounter. Their message isn't to erase Thanksgiving, but to remember all sides of the story. Today, Thanksgiving carries many meanings. For some, it's a day of faith. For others, family. For many, simply food and football. But behind every turkey and pie lies a 400-year-old story of hope and hardship, of two peoples meeting in uncertain peace. The Pilgrims' gratitude, the Wampanoag's generosity, and the centuries of struggle that followed, all are threads in the American tapestry. To give thanks today is to acknowledge both the light and the shadow, to celebrate the harvest of our blessings, and to remember the cost at which they came. Every November, as families gather around tables across the United States, that ancient rhythm repeats itself. The crackle of the fire, the clinking of plates, the whispered prayers before the meal, echoes of Plymouth, of Massasoit and Bradford, of loss and gratitude intertwined. And though the stories have changed, one truth endures. Gratitude is the bridge that connects us, across time, across cultures, across history itself. When we pause to give thanks, we become part of a line stretching back to that windswept clearing by the sea in 1621, where, for a brief, sacred moment, two peoples looked beyond their differences and shared the simple miracle of being alive. Like this video, subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.